There are many trades that happen every season in the MLB, but there are also some trades that almost happen. Some of these almost trades includes Hall of Famers being traded for each other, and other times they even determine who wins the World Series. Here are 8 trades that almost happened. One of the more prominent teams in the 90s was the Atlanta Braves, and they nearly added one of the best players ever to their team during this time. During spring training in 1992, the Pirates had a deal in place that was going to send Barry Bonds to Atlanta for relief pitcher Alejandro Pena and outfield prospect Keith Mitchell. Bonds was going to be a free agent after the season, so that probably was a big factor in why the Pirates were looking at potentially trading him. Once Jim Leyland, then Pirates manager, heard about them trading Bonds away, he reportedly blew up on the team's management over dumping salary. This was enough to keep the team from trading Bonds. It is fun though to imagine Bonds on the Braves and what could have possibly happened. Maybe they would have won more than one title, or maybe they weren't able to sign Greg Maddux. We don't really know. In the 1989 season, the Yankees were not looking like they were going to be contenders. They had an 8-time All-Star in Rickey Henderson, who was going to be a free agent that offseason. The team decided to shop Henderson around and see what they could get. The Giants were the first team that were able to reach a deal with the Yankees. The Giants would send outfielder Candy Maldonado and starting pitcher Scott Garrelts in exchange for Rickey Henderson. The problem was, Henderson had the option to veto any trade, and that's what he did. It has been reported the only team Henderson wanted to be traded to was Oakland. Well, 2 days later, that's what happened. The deal worked out well for Oakland, as they would win the World Series that year against none other than the San Francisco Giants. Henderson was the ALCS MVP and was 9 for 19 against the Giants in the World Series. If Henderson didn't veto the trade to the Giants, then they probably would have had a great chance to win the World Series themselves. As for the Yankees side, neither return for Henderson would have or did have much impact for the organization. If you enjoy baseball content, please consider subscribing. There are certain players you couldn't imagine in another team's uniform. Mariano Rivera is one of those players. However, that was almost the case. During spring training in 1996, the Yankees had a young shortstop who was struggling. This player was expected to be the team's everyday shortstop, but due to his play, there was concerns if he was ready. The Yankees decided to look to see if they could find a short-term solution. The Mariners were willing to trade shortstop Felix Furman and wanted either Bob Whitman or Mariano Rivera in return. Yankees owner George Steinbrenner was ready to do the deal. He was, fortunately, at least for the Yankees organization, talked out of it by a group that included the GM Bob Watson, assistant GM Brian Cashman, and an advisor Gene Michael. Furman would be released by the Mariners a month later, and the Yankees would get him anyway. He was never needed though, as the Yankees' young shortstop proved he was ready. Derek Jeter would go on to win the Rookie of the Year that season. At the time, Rivera wasn't yet a closer, and if the deal was made, the Mariners could have potentially used him as a starting pitcher. Thankfully, this deal didn't happen, as both Rivera and Jeter's career could have turned out drastically different. After a couple seasons well below 500 for the Marlins, and with a huge contract looming for Miguel Cabrera, the franchise decided they were going to trade him. The team who initially looked like they would get Cabrera was the Angels. There was a rough deal in place that would have sent second baseman Howie Kendrick, a young catcher in Jeff Mathis, either Nick Adenhart, who was the team's #1 prospect, or Irvin Santana, both of which were young pitchers, plus one additional pitching prospect who was described as mid-level to the Marlins in exchange for Cabrera. The deal fell through when the Marlins apparently wanted both Adenhart and Santana to be included in the deal at the last minute. This angered the Angels so much they no longer would pursue the deal unless the Marlins initiated the conversation to continue discussing a deal. A few other players that were considered in a deal was starting pitcher Joe Saunders, a high-end shortstop in Brandon Wood, Kendry Morales, and center fielder Reggie Willits, who had just finished 5th in Rookie of the Year in 2007. In the end, it really came down to the Angels not willing to let go of a few young pitchers. If given a redo, the Angels would definitely give up any or all the players that were discussed in order to get Cabrera. Going into the MLB winter meetings of 1999, one player was the talk of the town, and that was the kid, Ken Griffey Jr. Griffey wanted to be traded to a team that was closer to his family in Florida. It looked as though the Cincinnati Reds were all but certain to leave the winter meetings with Griffey on their roster. Surprisingly though, the Reds ownership started to have concerns on not being able to sign Griffey to an extension, since his contract would have expired after the following season. This gave an opportunity for another team to try and steal Griffey away from the Reds. Griffey had a no-trade clause and was said to be interested in going to only 4 teams, with one of them being the Mets. The Mariners and Mets agreed to a deal that sent Griffey to Queens in exchange for outfielder Roger Cedeno and starting pitchers Octavio Dotel and Armando Benitez. The Mets were so confident that they were getting Griffey, they told free agent Todd Zeile that he would have to restructure their apparent deal in order to land both Griffey and himself. This solidified Zeile's decision to sign with the Mets because he wanted to play with Griffey. Well, as you know, Griffey didn't play for the Mets, so what happened? The story was Griffey was given only 20 minutes to decide by the Mets if he was going to use his no-trade clause or waive it and become a Met. I don't know for sure if the apparent quick deadline was the deciding factor or not, but Griffey would use his no-trade clause to shut the deal down. Griffey would later learn that there was no 20-minute deadline for him to decide, but it was more of a miscommunication between the two teams' front offices. A couple months later, the Mariners and Reds would reach a deal that would send Griffey to Cincinnati. After signing Alex Rodriguez to the biggest contract in MLB history, the Texas Rangers were still a bad team. After 3 consecutive seasons finishing last place in their division, they were looking to trade him and that contract away. In the offseason following the 2003 season, the Red Sox were interested in A-Rod and put together an excellent offer to get him. They were going to send Manny Ramirez and pitching prospect John Lesser to Texas. Boston, however, wasn't willing to pay A-Rod his full salary, so he decided he would take $4 million less per season in exchange to be able to opt out of his contract every season starting in 2005. Both teams and A-Rod agreed on terms for this deal to happen, but once it came to the MLB Players Association, that's where it hit a snag. The MLBPA feared that this might set a precedent where teams might try and get away with paying players less, so the union decided to reject the deal. Boston was adamant they weren't going to pay A-Rod's full salary, so the deal never happened. He was eventually traded to the Yankees after Aaron Boone's knee injury for Alfonso Soriano before the 2004 season. In the end, it worked out for both the Yankees as they got A-Rod and the Red Sox because they won the 2004 World Series with Ramirez being named World Series MVP. The Rangers were the only team you would consider losers in this almost deal. During the 1980s, Don Mattingly and Will Clark were two of the league's best first basemen. They also were nearly traded for each other during this time as well. While the 1988 World Series was going on, Mattingly heard that the Yankees owner had agreed to a deal that was going to send him across the country to San Francisco. The reported deal was the Yankees received Will Clark plus 2 left-handed relief pitchers in Atlee Hammaker and Craig Lefferts, and the Giants would receive Don Mattingly and starting pitcher Rick Rhoden. The deal fell through due to a player that wasn't even involved in the trade. Around this time, another lefty pitcher for the Giants, Dave Dravecky, received devastating news. Doctors found a tumor on his pitching arm. This caused the Giants to pull out of the deal because they didn't want to send 2 lefty pitchers away. It turned out to be the right move by the Giants, as Dravecky would only pitch 13 more innings before his cancer came back and ended his career. Plus, Will Clark was just hitting his prime years of his career. Both teams have denied this deal and said it was just a rumor, but there have been multiple sources that said otherwise. As a baseball fan, there isn't much worse than seeing one of your team's most beloved players suiting up for a rival team. Well, that almost happened to one of MLB's biggest names in 1956. The Dodgers and Giants agreed on a trade that sent Dick Littlefield and $30,000 to the Dodgers for Jackie Robinson. Unknown to both teams, Robinson had already decided to retire from baseball. The reason it wasn't public knowledge yet was because he had a deal with Look magazine where they were paying him $50,000 to announce his retirement in the magazine. Robinson also had already lined up a job as vice president with Chock full o' Nuts, a coffee company. After finding out about this, the Giants VP, Chubby Feeney, still tried to make the trade happen. He convinced Chock full o' Nuts president, William Black, to allow Robinson to play one more year if he wanted to. However, Robinson's decision to retire was solidified after being accused of deceiving reporters into thinking he had planned to join the Giants and play in 1956 by the Dodgers VP, Buzzy Bavasi. After Robinson refused to report to the Giants, the trade was officially voided. I don't know about you, but I'm glad I never had to see Robinson in any other jersey besides the Dodgers. If you're interested in a part 2, let me know down in the comments.